Hi, and thank you all for joining our webinar today, where we're going to cover part 1 of Active Directory possible disasters and the best practices for recovering from each. We're very happy to have two great panelists on the line today. We have Sean Deuby. Sean is a solutions architect for Edgile Inc., where he helps Fortune 500 customers build hybrid identity solutions. Before joining Edgile, Sean was a technical director and analyst at Windows IT Pro, where he has over 400 published articles. Previously, Sean spent 10 years at Intel, where he was a leader of the IT Directory Services team and one of the original architects of the company's corporate Active Directory. Sean is also now a Microsoft MVP in the Directory Services and Enterprise Mobility expertise areas for 13 years and counting. Hi, Sean.
Hi, May. Yeah, 13 years and counting, fingers crossed, on January 1st.
Oh, good luck. And then we have Mickey Bresman on the line as well. Mickey is the CEO and co-founder of Semperis, and Mickey has nearly 2 decades of enterprise software experience, stretching back from his management roles in the Navy Computing Technical Unit to his days as a CTO of a Microsoft Gold Partner integration company. Hi, Mickey.
Hi, May. How are you?
Doing very well, thank you. On the line, we also have Guy Tavarovsky, who will join our panelists for the Q&A with more technical expertise for your questions if very technical questions do come up. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we actually kick things off. We are recording today's presentation, so if you have any colleagues who might want to watch this or you want to review parts of it later on, we will be in touch in just a few days and provide the recording link. In addition, if you have any questions, please post them using the webinar question tool. We are collecting all of them, and at the end we will answer all of your questions. With that, Mickey, please feel free to begin the presentation today.
Thank you, Maytal. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Mickey, and I am the CEO of Semperis. Semperis is an identity and access management provider for hybrid IT environments. Our technology focuses on 2 key solutions: a full force recovery solution based on a simple restoration wizard, where we were able to simplify the recovery process to 3 simple steps, fully automating the Active Directory disaster recovery process. That would be the Semperis ADFR. And the Semperis Active Directory State Manager that constantly tracks all of the Active Directory modifications, storing them in an SQL database, which provides a fast and simple comparison of different Active Directory states with rich queries and restoration mechanism. I would like to remind you that this webinar recording will be uploaded to the Semperis website, where you can find the previous webinar's recording and sign up for the next month webinar on AD as well. And with that, Sean?
Sure, thanks, Mickey. I think that a key thing to understand with Active Directory, in an area that a lot of people just don't seem to get right, is people tend to be very focused on Active Directory and its domain controllers, and how it's so well put together against physical disasters. You know, a data center burns up, or there's an earthquake and 2 data centers stop functioning correctly or lose network connectivity. And we all know, hey, Active Directory, it's great. You know, the rest of the domain controllers will continue to function. More or less everybody has a copy of everything, so it's fine. But where I think people often have a false sense of security about Active Directory redundancy and fault tolerance is in the data aspect of Active Directory, where if you lose a domain controller, that's fine, but if you have problems with your Active Directory data, depending on what the type of problem is, that data can be extremely efficiently replicated throughout your entire domain, or depending on what partition you're working with, throughout the forest. AD over time has gotten very good at not replicating known bad data. So for example, lingering objects. But it will replicate errors, it'll replicate inadvertent changes, and anything else that's okay in its model just fine. So something happens that Active Directory thinks is okay within its data model, all of a sudden, before you know it, it's all the way across your domain or all the way across your forest. Now, there are, of course, ways when Microsoft came out with Active Directory to recover from these issues. But they are, if anyone's ever tried to do an authoritative restore, these are, among other techniques, these are very, very basic techniques, and they take a long time. And I think that's really a key, it's a really key thing to Active Directory recovery because it is such a base functionality. Time is of the essence. Time is always of the essence in Active Directory recovery. And so even if you have a procedure laid out with how to do that recovery, it takes time. And I might add, from personal experience, time to recovery, it's one thing to have a procedure in front of you. It's another thing to have 5 managers leaning over your shoulders screaming about when is it going to be back up kind of recovery. So you can use tricks. You know, for example, you can create a dedicated Active Directory site and you tell your staff that you're only going to make changes at that site and you set the replication interval to be delayed to happen only every 15 minutes or something like that to slow down so that if somebody makes an oops, you have a chance to try to pull it back. But all of these are, for a product that is as critical as Active Directory is, all of these I believe are kind of half measures.
So just to add on a small example that you've just mentioned, because we've seen an issue with that also, we had several customers that had what I think that you refer to as a lag site, and what happened with that was that the change was actually done just a minute or two before the replication kicked in. So the thing with the lag site is that you need to remember that you don't always control the time of the change as compared to the time of the actual replication.
True. Yeah, and actually I put together a very short script that uses that kitchen sink of replication tools for Active Directory rep-admin, sorry. And there is an advanced option in rep-admin that will disable outbound replication. So there is what I call the uh-oh switch. When one of your admins says, oops, you lunge for that script to disable outbound replication so the change can't make its way out further. But again, that's no way to run a company for something as important as this.
Yeah, so just to like a very short overview of what we're about to discuss here. So the first example with identity management changes, basically we're going to talk about a scenario where you are introducing a new identity management solution which has roles and templates that needs to be configured against the different operations in the organization. And in this specific scenario that we're about to cover is what we've seen is that somebody made a mistake basically leading to the wrong templates being executing against different roles, leading to a situation where you have people from the IT, just an example, being put to the management groups, and you have people from sales being moved to the internship groups, and so on. And on top of that, you also had several hundred of servers going down because they have just lost their group membership in the application service groups. So that's the scenario, and we're going to discuss a bit what happened there and how we were able to help. So that's the first one. The DNS record modifications, I think it's quite obvious. But just to explain what we're about to discuss, as we all know, there are different types of records, SRV, A, and so on. So we're going to discuss one of the scenarios. As an IT manager, you just made an upgrade to the new Skype for Business solution, just as an example. you have modified the DNS records to point to the new environment that you have set up, and what happens when something just doesn't work. So that would be the next conversation. Then we will have the very hot topic now, the upgrade from Windows 2003 to Windows 2008 R2, or to the Windows 2012 for that matter, or even 16 if you are already there. And as you probably know, there are several steps during the process which are kind of one way, starting from the schema extension through the domain and forest level function raise, and how do you mitigate the risks of some of the applications that might be, although you probably tested them as much as you can, but all of a sudden you find out that one or two of the applications, or maybe more, are not compatible with the new functional level. How do you respond to that? So that's for the upgrade from Windows 2003 server and to one of the above versions. DNS zone restoration, that's a very interesting case studies. I don't know exactly why, but we have seen several of those during the last even 4 months, even less I think, with major organizations, with all the procedures in place, and still, well, I will describe it in more details what happened and why, and how you can recover from something like that. And the last one, the lost configuration partition permissions, that's also a very interesting case study. I think it has to do more with the even the security side of things, and because in that case that was actually done in purpose by a malicious admin. So we're going to discuss and see how do you react to something like that, what does it do to your organization, and all the scenario and what happened there.
So I actually have a quick question for all of you, and the question is fairly simple. We want to know if you and your administrator have ever accidentally changed or deleted objects that you had to actually recover from. And then we have a few options for you. You may remember such a case, or you're not sure. It never happened to you, or it never happened to you, but you feel it's a possibility and you are concerned about it. We'll leave the poll open for just a couple more seconds because there are a few people who haven't had the chance to answer, and then we'll display the results. So let's close the poll quickly and share the results with you because I feel the results are not surprising to Sean and Mickey, but maybe yes, surprising to other people. It seems like over half of our attendees today actually did have the what Sean refers to as the oops factor, where they made a change and then had to recover from it. About 20% of our attendees never had anything like that happen, and another 20% didn't have this happen to them, fortunately, but feel this might be a possibility. With that, let's move forward with the presentation so you can learn about recovery best practices.
Thank you. So let's go over the IDM changes. So the case study that we had was with what was one of the finance institutions, and what happened there was pretty much the following. At some point it was decided to stop using the current identity management or role-based management solution that the organization had, and they were switching to a new solution that will provide them with the more granular options to provide different roles and connect different applications and so on. Well, we all know the reasons for why do you need such a solution in place. During the migration phase, something happened, and there was some kind of a mistake introduced to the environment that actually completely mixed some of the permissions there. So what happened basically is that there were a few thousands of people that were placed in the wrong groups, and what it meant is that actually they can no longer do their job because they don't have permissions to access all the resources that they need in order to perform their job. And from the other hand, there was kind of a security concern because they all had too much permissions for different resources that they don't really need to be accessing. So that was the case. In addition to that, we also had several hundreds of servers going down, and that's because those servers lost the group membership in the application groups that they belong to, and that kind of created a chaos. So the next thing that the customer did, they manually recovered the servers. That was relatively, I don't know if simple, but not that hard to do because there's only a certain number of servers. You probably have records of which groups they're supposed to belong to. So that was the first thing that they did, and that was done manually.
So what I think is interesting about this case is that, kind of to what I was saying before, is that from Active Directory's point of view, this is a perfectly valid set of changes. No reason to not replicate it across whatever partition you're working in. No reason to not do it as a normal change. The other aspect of it, and because people always fall back to recycle bin, is that this is a situation where recycle bin wouldn't help because you haven't actually deleted anything. You've just changed things. So now, and as we know, Active Directory doesn't have any built-in transactional rollback capabilities. So yeah, the admins are left trying to piece back together what happened. There's no kind of a mess you can get yourself in like an automated mess.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. Yeah, so where we came in basically was that we knew that they had all of those group membership being modified, and we also knew that some of them were then, I would say, modified again manually in order to try and recover some of the things. The administrators were not sure if they got it in the right groups or not. There was some concern about how it actually is supposed to look like, and they were not sure exactly what to do next. So the first thing that we needed to do when we came in was actually to try and understand what happened, meaning you need to be able to actually see all the changes and to be able to perform queries with basically something like, show me all the changes that happened between two periods of time, and that applies to user accounts, just as an example, that were only modified but not deleted or anything like that. And we knew that the role-based system is working with certain attributes, like I think in their case there was the office and the manager and the phone number. I think that was the 3-1 that they used in order to place different roles in places. So we need to have some kind of a solution to look into all of this information, and then to have as a result a report that will show you exactly what happened there, and then as soon as we found all of those changes, simply revert them to the previous state. And that's exactly what we did there by using a continuous tracking solution. I'm sure that you guys probably know that by default Active Directory does not provide any tracking mechanism, which is basically what creates the challenge from the first place. But in this case, if you have a tracking mechanism in place that constantly tracks all of the changes that are introduced to the environment, you can then very easily compare different points in time, see exactly what have changed in the environment, and then revert it back to the previous state.
Yeah, it's the speed thing that is so important.
Yeah, it's speed, and also, well, you can, I think that we can all agree that many of the things that you can do automatically here is that it's most of the things you can do manually. You will probably can go and figure out by an HR system what the roles are supposed to be. Like, you can do the whole thing. The only question would be, can you afford yourself to spend a day or two or whatever it takes to actually manually recover the entire information? So that's for the IDM change. DNS record modification. Sean, you want to take this one?
Sure. Actually, I have I have sort of an experience with this with Intel as well. So this is a situation where you're upgrading some aspect, and it requires that you add records to DNS that weren't there before, so that the audio-video functions correctly. And the issue is some users can't log in. Some users can't find the servers that they need, can't find Skype for Business, can't find the resources because those SIP records are not showing in DNS. And of course, that really impacts the learning event. And you know there's a problem with DNS records in the DNS Active Directory integrated DNS partition. But the problem is you don't know what's changed. They're possibly not deleted, but something has changed. And so you have to figure out what has changed from the way it was to the way it is.
Yeah, so what we did there, basically in order to recover from such a scenario, what you need to be able to see inside the DNS record even prior to the restoration, because you might be in a situation where the record was modified, maybe even more than once, and you also want to make sure that actually reverting the record will help. So in that case, you would want to see what was the previous value, where it was pointing, if it's an SRV record, it was pointing to a different A record, and so on. And then if you can quickly compare what has been changed, you can then revert it to the previous state and make sure that you have the organization up and running again. I guess that's what's interesting to note about this case is that, just as you said, objects were changed, not deleted. So again, recycle bin cannot help you in any way. Do you want to go over the frequent system snapshots? Because I think there was also questions about this one.
Sure. I mean, one of the native tools that is built into Active Directory is the ability on a domain controller to take a snapshot of the current state. And you can take a number of snapshots, and then you can do a comparison if you mount the old snapshot and mount the new snapshot. And then you may, you know, there are various data tools that you can do to export the data and compare them in an Excel spreadsheet, or pull them up in a SQL database and do a comparison, any number of ways that you could do it. But again, it's very basic, and it takes time. It takes time and often a high degree of expertise that the Active Directory administrator may not have. They may be an AD administrator, but they're not so great in doing data comparisons. They have to pull other people in from other teams. So it can be done, but not easily.
Yeah, I agree with that. So again, if you have a solution that constantly tracks all the changes that are introduced to your environment, including the DNS, of course, and we can also discuss, by the way, what happens if you have an integrated DNS as opposed to some kind of a third-party solution. But you probably need to track, well, not probably, you need to track no matter what type of solution you are using. And then you need to be able to look inside the DNS records and get like an educated decision on where do you want to go from here. Do you want to point to the old system? Do you want to maybe modify the record in a different way? But that's the kind of the challenge that you will have there. The next one, and I've seen that there are several questions specifically about this scenario, so I will answer the questions that I hope during the case study as well. So as you guys probably know, the Windows 2003 end of life came, I think, about a year ago already. And there are many organizations that still have some of the domain controllers running Windows 2003. Or even what we see more commonly now is organizations that have upgraded the domain controllers to be Windows 2008 L2 and above. but they still haven't done the domain functional level raise and have not performed the forest functional level raise. And the reason for that, as you probably know, there might be some application that cannot work in this new level, and you probably will want to spin out a lab environment where you want to test everything. And one of the things that we always tell the people that we work with that in that situation is that by just implementing a new Active Directory in the test environment and checking your applications there, you are only doing part of what should be done. As you probably know, you might have some extensions to your Active Directory schema that were not standard, and you probably want to make sure that when you perform those tests in the lab environment, you need to have a copy of your actual Active Directory. That's probably the only way to make sure that you actually have tested as much as you can. And so that's the first takeaway from that. The second one was, okay, but some of those steps, like the functional level of the forest or the domain or the schema extension, are all one way, meaning there is no click and revert to the previous state. And then what happens if we did all the tests, we thought that everything is great, but we all know that sometimes things just happened, and some of the applications are not operating the way that was expected. And as you guys all probably know about the Murphy Law, that will probably be the most important applications at the time. So that...
I have a real-life example of exactly what you're saying at Intel. I was involved in upgrading, I can't remember if it was from 2003 to 2008 or 2000 to 2003, and communication between a domain client and an Active Directory had gotten more secure, so I believe it required signed communication. I think that's what it was. This was quite a long time ago, and we thoroughly tested it in our lab. We actually took Intel's. We made a backup copy of Intel's worldwide Active Directory, took it up to Microsoft, to the Enterprise Engineering Center, the AEC, and restored it in an air-gapped network, and did upgrades just to make sure that it would work. But as anybody that's done AD administration for any length of time knows, you really don't know what is out there using Active Directory. You don't know the apps that are out there that depend on AD and, God forbid, depend on a specific, they've hard-coded an IP address of a domain controller in place, or something like that. So you test as much as you can, and you work with the stakeholders that you know, but there are applications out there you aren't aware of. And that's a long introduction for saying I was doing this upgrade, and this upgrade involved higher security and communications to the domain controller. And we piloted a couple of domain controllers upgrading there, and in our Intel manufacturing environment, the engineering requirement, the folks that do the chip design, they use NetApp filers, very, very large file servers, and they run a specialized OS version. And their filers started failing and not being able to authenticate to Active Directory. Significant problem here. So everybody started scrambling and trying to figure out what it was, and we realized that the filer operating systems needed to be upgraded to the latest version that engineering hadn't gone through and thoroughly tested yet before they would communicate with an upgraded Active Directory. So we had a little bit of a fire drill as engineering computing rushed through approval of the upgraded filer OS and proceeded to upgrade several hundred NetApp filers over the next few weeks, so they would actually start working with the upgraded Active Directory.
Yeah, that's a great example. I actually experiencing something quite similar. Another very big organization with a huge manufacturing floor. They have, I don't even want to try and guess how many machines, but it's a very big one. And what happened there, as part of the upgrade that they were doing, they were also changing the authentication from being NTLM version 1 to NTLM version 2. And all of a sudden, the entire floor just stops. And yeah, everybody panics, everybody tries, and nobody thinks, at least at the beginning, that what happened with the AD change have something to do with the machines, because those are floor machines. A few hours after, I think, and a lot of stress, they actually found out that the machines are authenticating and they do not support NTLM version 2. So they had to find a way to revert that for the NTLM version 1, and the floor continued to work. But that was a very straightforward several hours. I'm sure that if you ever ran an AD environment, you probably can understand how stressful those can be. So what can you do in order to recover from such an environment? I guess that the simple answer is that, as we know, if you go through those changes that are only one way, the only way to go back is basically to recover the entire Active Directory environment. Now on the manual side of it, there is a procedure by Microsoft which has like 50 steps that you probably that you need to follow, and that include removing the domain controllers, well, the Active Directory part from the domain controllers in the environment, and then starting to introduce them in a very certain sequence that you need to follow, and you need to look out from some certain things. Just as an example, if you remove the global catalog part and then rebooted the machines, then you are no longer able to log in. So there are several catches there that you need to make sure that you follow, but this can definitely be done in a manual way. And again, as with all the previous examples, the only question would be how much time will it actually take you? The other way to do it would be having an automated orchestration solution that can actually perform the entire restoration of the forest or domain, depends on what is it that was destroyed, and reverting that to the previous state. DNS zone restoration. So we had several of those, as I mentioned, but I will describe just one of them in a very interesting sequence of what actually happened there. So we got a call from one of the customers, and he described the following. We have accidentally deleted a zone. This is a global organization. They have AD presence in Europe, in India, in the States, of course. I think also some of the Asia Pacific. I'm not exactly remember all of it, but they're quite big and they're very much spread all around. And they were quite lucky because they deleted the European zone during the night time in Europe, which was very helpful, a bit less stress. And so we have this call, and they describe a situation where they have deleted the zone, and for some reason they're unable to recover it. So something there sounds a bit weird. We're starting to try and understand what exactly happened, because if you just deleted it, in this specific case, the recycle bit should be able to help, but when we're starting to actually ask the different, there were, I think, 3 different administrators on the line. So apparently some of them were doing things that the other 2 did not kind of knew about. So after they deleted it, they tried to manually rebuild it by using some PowerShell scripts against the recovery bin, if I remember correctly. Something did not work there, so they only partially restored it. I mean, they restored just some of the records, and then They tried to pull it from another backup that they had I think on tapes, and then they deleted it because they found out that it's not what they needed. Long story short, by the time that we were having this conversation, it was quite clear that what we have on the recycle bin is not relevant, because that was modified several times with the wrong data. And we have an empty DNS zone for the EU environment. So that was the situation. Sean, you want to go over the authoritative restore?
Sure. The classic way of restoring any directory partition, including an application partition such as an AD integrated DNS zone, is to do an authoritative restore. So, an authoritative restore of a DNS partition is, first and foremost, takes time. It's a skilled manual effort. Most of us don't do authoritative restores very often. You have to take a domain controller offline. You have to do a non-authoritative restore of that partition from a known good backup. Then you have to mark the DNS partition as authoritative. And there are a couple of other little things you need to do in the case of a DNS partition. So this is not as onerous as some of these other restore situations are, but it's still complicated, and then you have the issue of records that have changed since that previous backup, since DNS records change, on a second-by-second basis. So you have some other work to do to get that all back in place. Again, it can be done, takes a good amount of skill, and may take a lot of time.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. But what was done in that case? We simply pull out one of the latest states that we have for that DNS zone. We made sure together with the administrators that they actually have the records that they were expecting to see on a certain point in time. 2 more clicks and the zone was up and running. Lost configuration partition permissions. So here is the scenario. What we experienced with the customer was the following. All of a sudden, you can no longer create any new type of objects. That was the complaint. You cannot create new users, you cannot create, well, anything basically. The objects that you do have continue to operate normally, meaning users do have the option to perform logins and they do able to access the resources that they need, but you cannot introduce anything new to the environment. So we were trying to figure out what happened there, just to understand what is it that we need to fix. And then it was, what we found out is the replication have stopped, and while trying to figure out what happened there exactly, the next thing that was noticed that nobody can actually access the configuration partition anymore. So what we did there is we waited till the end of the day and we simply restored the configuration partition back in place, and everybody was happy because it seems that we are done with the problem. Until the next morning, when again, for some reason, nobody can do, nobody can create new objects, and again, the replication have stopped, and the rest seems to be working all right. But we also seen that nobody again can access the configuration partition. So what we did then was actually to recover the configuration partitions once again, and then simply remove all the people from the domain admin group and go one by one and trying to figure out who is that and why is he there. That probably should have been done way before we came in. That's more into the policy of the organization. But what they found out is that there was one of the people that was defined as a domain admin was actually let go just a few days before the first accident or incident, I would say. And apparently he just modified the permission, and that's very easy thing to do with by using the ADSI edit tool. You can simply remove permissions from the configuration partition. It basically takes like 4 clicks. So that was the issue there. Another example, by the way, that I've seen, which was much worse, and it was actually done by kind of by a mistake, because the guy that was testing it, he wanted to see, well, I'm not sure, but he wanted kind of to see what will happen, because he thought that it's not a production environment where he was testing it. But basically what he did, he opened the standard users and computers MMC, and then he chose all the domain controllers in the environment and removed the read permissions from those accounts. That's just, again, 2 clicks. And all of a sudden, you no longer can access your AD at all. So that is even worse scenario to what can happen. And I think what's interesting about those scenarios is that they're all done with the native tools. You don't need to do anything special. It's just a simple thing. AD by default will not stop you from doing it because you're not doing anything that is considered to be wrong. And all of a sudden you have an environment that you either cannot access, or you have an environment where some of the things are no longer functional.
Yeah, so that was with his previous company, right? Because it didn't stay. And I think the example brings out a really good point, which is, and I see this all the time in my consulting practice during the day, people forget about the configuration partition, and they think the domain is a security boundary. They'll set up a separate domain for some other group because they feel that, oh, well, we don't administer them, or we don't like them, or whatever reason that they have. And people seem to forget that the configuration partition is shared across the entire forest. So if you have somebody with domain admin rights in a child domain, you're not safe from that SQL administrator, from that person with domain administration rights, because they can jack with the configuration partition and compromise the whole forest.
Yep. So Sean, would you like to go quickly over the summary and takeaways, and then we'll do some Q&A?
Sure, happy to. So I think by now we've pretty well described, companies prepare for physical disasters. They think about domain controllers, and not so often do they think about logical disasters, which are, I would say, almost very, very often take far longer to recover from than losing a domain controller. You can have the oops mistake. You can have malicious activity. Again, on our configuration partition example. The recycle bin will help you if an object has been deleted, probably. Mickey pointed out an example where it didn't really help them that much. And backing up domain controllers is essential, but that's far from all of the solution. There's a lot more that has to happen beyond that to be able to do something quickly. And the last bullet is really an excellent point. Time is money. If you compute, and it's not too hard to do, if you compute how much a domain-wide Active Directory failure would cost your company on an hourly basis for 1 hour, applications don't work, users can't log in, they can't access resources, email doesn't work, pretty much everything doesn't work. You're going to have some big numbers. And anything to speed up time to recovery will pay for itself in literally minutes if something happens.
Yeah, so with that, I just want to quickly explain the 2 solutions that we have as Semperis that covers those types of scenarios that we just discussed. So the first one would be the Semperis Active Directory State Manager, which basically tracks all of the changes that are introduced to the AD environment. And what's unique about this solution is that it is doing it in real time. We are using the same type of mechanism as the domain controllers use for the replication, and that way we can constantly pull for changes by simply pulling them from the domain controllers. And then all of this restoration, all of this information, will be stored in an SQL backend, which provides you with a very simple way to compare different points in time, see the changes that were introduced to the environment, and then if you don't like any of those, simply revert them to the previous state. I think what's unique about this solution is it's not a backup and recovery solution in terms of a daily backup or 2 times a day or something similar. It actually tracks everything all the time. And when you actually want to recover something, you don't need to waste time on mounting the backup or extracting it. You simply perform a query against the database. So that's the Semperis Active Directory State Manager. And then the Semperis Active Directory Forest Recovery is basically a disaster recovery solution for the Active Directory. It has an orchestration of the forest or domain recovery, depends on the situation that you have. And what we were able to achieve there is basically to get to a point where you can recover the entire environment with just 3 clicks. And that is also achieved by the way that we perform the backup of the environment in this case, in that instead of trying to just back up domain controllers and figure out how to glue the backup between them, what each one of the backup sets there contains is things like the Active Directory metadata, the DNS settings, which domain controllers are in charge of which zones and which domain controllers look in which zones. And also as part of the questions here, also the FISMA roles, well, everything that has to do with your AD environment, which then allows us to recover you to the previous known good state. So that's all we have for today, and we'll be happy to answer some questions. Metal, if we have Guy, I think it would be great if he can answer some of the more technical questions that were asked during the presentation.
I just want to firstly thank Mickey and Sean for a great presentation, and thank Guy for joining us in time for the Q&A. The first question that we had come in today was actually about best practices of backup. It seems like a lot of people who are on this session are concerned about the quality of their backups. And more specifically, when a company is making backups to the state of a domain controller, do you feel it is important for a successful outcome to also back up and restore the main FSMO holder?
So I'll take that one. So let's start with the best practices. Well, the technical requirements are that you need to restore at least one domain controller in each domain in the forest. But in larger environments, it gets much more complicated. If you have 300 domain controllers dispersed all over the world, and you have data centers in the United States and in Europe and Japan and Africa. Well, those domain controllers, if you restore only one of them, you won't be able to provide any AD functionality to your consumers, to your users. So you needed to plan. Usually you'd want to plan your backups so you restore your core AD functionality per each core data center. So if you have large data center with a lot of servers and applications concentrated in Germany and Texas and Tokyo, you would probably want to restore a certain amount of domain controls per each domain, per each data center, so that those domain controls will be able to provide core functionality to your line of business applications that you want to be able, to continue performing, continue working. So you want to restore the application functionality so that business can continue. And after that, depending, it gets bit more complicated because you need to account for the disk space, you need to account for network throughput, and stuff like that. So for more simple environments, the usual rule of thumb is either 2 domain controllers per domain or 2 domain controllers per each core data center. But the larger you get, the more domain controllers you would want to restore initially, and the rest of the domain controllers can be re-promoted later. So that's from the best practices point of view. Mital, can you please remind the second part of the question?
Yes, of course. The second part of the question was actually related to whether or not you thought it was important when you were backing up a domain controller to also back up and restore the main FSMO holder.
So actually, the Microsoft best practice says that you should not be restoring a read master role holder, though actually in the recent versions there is already a protection in place that will not trigger the issues that used to be that used to rise as a result of read master being restored from backup. But still, if you break it down, PDC emulator is used for time synchronization and password chaining. You can easily move it to a different domain controller. Schema master is in use only if you want to change your schema. Domain name in master is required when you want to introduce new domains, trusts, or manage existing trusts, or create application partitions, stuff like that. Yeah, again, not really in use. And infrastructure master, if you switch to recycle bin, actually all of your domain controllers are already infrastructure masters. So, and if all of your domain controllers are global catalogs, again, infrastructure master is not really doing anything. So if you look at it, really, it doesn't really matter. What you need to account for is you need to eventually restore the functionality of the role. So you could restore a different domain controller and seize those roles to the domain controller that you have restored. You need those roles, but they don't have to be restored on the same domain controller that originally owned those roles. Okay.
Thank you, Guy. I think we have about 3 minutes left on the webinar, so I would like to take one last question that came in from the audience today. And following that, we will wrap up and follow up with individuals personally over email and answer their questions that came in. So the next question, and I think it came up quite a few times from our audience today, is that what about schema changes? How do you undo schema changes when they happen?
So schema changes are irreversible. The only way you cannot delete objects in the schema. What you can do is you can defunct them. So you can mark some objects, classes, and attributes as disabled, as not in use, and it will result in AD not using those classes and attributes. But if you really want to roll your schema back to some previous state, the only way to do that is an actual forced recovery, full forced recovery. So yes, that's about the schema changes.
Thanks, Guy. With that, I would like to thank our audience for joining and sticking with us. We apologize again for the little bit of audio glitches that we had throughout the webinar. We did record this session, so if you want to review any part of it, we will be in touch in a few days. And again, feel free to email us anytime if you want to ask any additional questions after the webinar is ended. Thank you, and have a nice rest of your day.